All right, well, Nana, thanks again for taking the time to sit down and chat with me. I'm so grateful that we get to do this. It's such a treat for me, and I know for anyone that's listening, there's so many bits and pieces of wisdom and also just good laughs that they'll be able to pull out of it. So thanks again for your time.
You're welcome. I can't believe I've done this. And I'm doing it still.
Well, I'm really, really grateful that you are. And you said something a couple minutes ago about teaching and how you've been able to touch so many lives. And I'm reminded of a magnet on your refrigerator that's, and I think it's been there my whole life, and it says, "To teach is to touch lives forever." And I thought that that would be a really good sort of segue into telling us about your professional life and career. Give us a little background on your career.
It's interesting that all through high school and college, I never wanted to teach. In fact, that was almost at the bottom of my list. And all through college and graduate school, I never took an education course because I really wasn't interested. And then here I am. Suddenly, I decided to change and try all things I could do with the training I had, and teaching was one of them. And so that's how I entered the field of education. And contrary to what I ever believed, I really loved it. I loved it. I started out teaching elementary school, but not in a classroom. I was a teacher of speech improvement. So I was doing speech therapy with elementary school kids. And I had to set up my own clinics, and I would have a time set aside for stutterers, and a time set aside for lispers, and a time set aside for articulation, and a time for voice. And it worked fine. And I had 6 schools that I visited in a week. One day, on Thursday, I had a morning school and an afternoon school. And all those others were the whole day spent there, and again, all elementary schools. And then I guess there were 2 things that occurred while I was doing all this work. And one was that when I arrived at a school and was punching in the time clock, as other teachers were, and they would see me and they would say, "Oh, is it Wednesday already?" And I could see it wasn't a happy time because I never thought about it that way. I was only thinking about what I was doing in the school. But to think about it, I was taking out 2 or 3 from this class at one time, and 1 or 2 at another time, and 1 or so at another time. So the teacher was always having an interruption in the lesson that she was teaching. So obviously she wasn't so happy about that. And the only person who was really happy to see me was the principal, because his school was getting a service, and that was a good thing for him. So, and the other thing, working with elementary school children, was that I forever had colds. As a teacher working with speech, you were close to each student that you were working with, and I was always getting colds. So after a year and a half of doing this, I decided to try teaching on the high school level. And so I took the exam. Everything at the Board of Ed was with an exam. And so I took the exam for teacher of speech in the high school, and that's when I entered the high schools. And that was quite a difference. I was hired by the chairperson of that department, who was relatively new as a chairperson herself, because I had a therapy background. And the high school taught had speech clinics, and they also taught speech arts, which was dramatics and public speaking and play production and oral interpretation, discussion and debate. It's all of that. And all of the people in the speech department were would-be actors and actresses. None of them really cared to teach the speech clinics. So here I came from a speech therapy background, and so I was hired. And her philosophy was that everyone in the department had to be able to teach every class that was taught in that department. So I was happy to come into the clinics, but I was a little bit hesitant about learning to teach dramatics and public speaking, et cetera, et cetera. Public speaking wasn't bad because I had a lot of rhetoric classes in college, and so I was most comfortable in that area. But that's how I managed to go into a speech department in a high school, and that's where I stayed for the rest of my teaching career.
From speech, you also at some point transitioned into ESL. For those who are listening, that's English as a second language. How did you make that transition, and how did that sort of blend into public speaking and speech and getting rid of speech disorders?
Well, public speaking was separate from speech correction or speech therapy. That was in the speech arts. And as far as ESL was concerned, one of the clinic classes that we had when I entered the department was a foreign accent clinic. And over the years, the demographics changed in Jamaica. Many people moved out and many people moved in, and the people who were coming in were in large part foreign people. And so the students who were coming into the school came in with an English language difficulty. And so our foreign accent clinic became more than just an accent now. Now you had to work with people who really didn't know English to begin with. And so the ESL program began at Jamaica High School, and I was very eager and pleased to be part of that because my graduate work at Cornell was in speech correction. And the thesis that I wrote while I was in graduate school was in ESL, especially with the Japanese language, people who spoke Japanese wanting to learn English. Actually, the title describes the work that I did, and the title of my thesis was dear me, I can't believe how words escape me. It was on the Japanese language, of Japanese learning English, that was called it was right here and disappeared immediately. This is what happens to me.
Is it in Japanese or is it in English?
No, it's total. I don't know Japanese. Okay. No. It was a study of the phonemic structure of Japanese, which is the sound structure of the language, phonemes, specific sounds, compared to the sounds that are present in English. And it was a comparison of those two systems, plus what was necessary for the Japanese student to learn to be able to speak English properly. Actually, if we were going to Japan, we would have to do the same thing. Adapt to the sound structure. Some of the sounds in Japanese do not include some sounds that are in English. So they had to learn to make a sound that they didn't have in their language, and vice versa. We had to learn, if we're learning Japanese, to make sounds that we don't have in our language, in English. Just as a simple example, we do not have a sound in English that Japanese has, which is a mixture of L and R. And I cannot say that sound for you because I don't know it. I haven't learned it. I don't speak the Japanese language. But when the Japanese learn English and they have to say an L or an R in a sound. I'm giving you letters, not sounds. I mean, this is very confusing because letters L is made up of 2 or 3 different sounds, right? R, right? But when when they say a word with, for example, lead and read, they sound the same except one has an L and one has an R. And when they want to say lead, they're going to say the sound in their language, which is between an L and an R. So when they say lead with an L for us, we hear the R part of their sound. And when they want to say read, they're going to put their sound in, and we hear the L sound in that particular sound. I cannot make that sound because I never learned it, but that's an example of sounds that are present in one language and not in another, and the substitutions that are made, which leads to confusion to us.
You used the word phonemic a couple of minutes
Yes.
ago. What's the difference between phonemic and phonetic?
Phoneme is a sound structure. For example, is a phoneme. E is a phoneme. L is a phoneme. It's a specific, distinct sound. Phonetics is the language that you write expressing that sound. So I learned phonetics. I mean, when you speak, I can write it down in phonetics so that if I have to say it back to you, I'm not really reading words, I am reading sounds. And of course, it's the sound that you said. And I'll tell you, sometimes when I want to remember something that was said in another language and I don't understand it, I remember I did this with some Jewish expressions that my friends had said, and I wanted to be able to remember them. And I would ask them to say it, and I would write it in phonetics. And so when I wanted to say it, I would read my phonetics, say the sound, and I'm saying it. Although I don't know what I'm saying, but I know what I read. I interpreted my phonetic symbol into a sound and therefore was able to communicate that.
I'm going to pause for a sec and turn that stove off, okay?
Oh, yes, please.
Hang tight. So tell me about how you got involved with this project. How did it become your thesis? How did you choose it? And also, where did it go? What did it turn into?
When I went to Cornell for my master's degree, my mentor had planned out a program of courses for me to take. And one of them was a 3-credit course on writing a thesis. But it was a 3-credit course. It was almost like a composition course in writing up a project that you might have undertaken. But what actually ended up being by the end of the year was my having selected a topic that was extremely interesting for me, and it developed into a full-scale thesis, which I think amazed my mentor, very much so. And when I finished the project, it was like 80 pages long. It became a thesis quality of almost of a PhD thesis, and I had to defend it at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, like people do, to defend your thesis to your professors and whatever. But the topic came about because every Sunday I would go to the student center and play bridge, and that was where I met a group of Japanese men who were sent by their companies in Japan to get a master's, most of them in either finance or economics. They were middle-aged men. They weren't the typical college student that you have here, but they played bridge. And so Every Sunday I started playing bridge, and as we were playing, I became much more aware of their speech pattern in English, and I was asking them questions about sounds and such, and that's what really fueled my interest in the speech patterns of the Japanese people, and that's how I managed to get down to the nitty-gritty and began a study of every of the sounds of Japanese and the sounds of English and the problems they had in speaking and how they could learn to speak English better. So my thesis was really a book on improving speech for the Japanese people.
And once you defended this thesis, did anything become of it? Did anybody take an interest in it?
Well, at the time, I passed. It was like a test, right? But when I graduated, the summer after I graduated, I got a letter from a professor at Bucknell University who was teaching a summer program in English as a second language. And he told me that my professor, C.K. Thomas at Cornell, had sent him a copy of my thesis, and he congratulated me on an excellent piece of work, and he told me he was using it as his text in his class. So that was a big plus.
Wow. So even when you weren't intending to teach, your work ended up being used as a teaching asset, really.
Yes, so that was really special. And that's why I knew that C.K. Thomas was always very happy with the work that I was doing. And he had 3 graduate students under his care when I was there for the year. I was the only woman. That wasn't unusual. I was the only woman. Lots of, there were a lot. And that reminds me, I was there 2 months, and the person, the graduate student with C.K. Thomas was drafted, and he had to leave to go. So he was the director of the speech clinic, and they offered me the job. And I'd only been there for like 2 months into my master's program. And they gave me a small stipend, which I thought was terrific. I loved it. And I remember writing a postcard home to my parents saying, I'm so happy. They gave me a job and they're paying me for it.
That's unbelievable. It sounds like they really believed in you.
So I had a very, very happy time. I was very well received by everyone. And C.K. Thomas, who was one of the 4 leading phoneticians in the United States, right? He was very well known in his area, and he really took me under his wing, and I ran with it.
That's awesome. Speaking of stipends, I remember oftentimes, I think you've told me many, I feel like I always hear you say this. You'd say, that it was an often occurrence for you to forget to pick up your paycheck at work at Jamaica High School.
Yes.
What's the significance there?
Because I had other things on my mind. I loved what I was doing. And even though I left the school, I left with all the thoughts of the things I wanted to do. It was just a very happy time. That's why I say, there were some teachers in the school, not just, I won't say my department, but in the school, that really came in to teach. They stayed their hours, they punched in and they punched out, and that was all it was. It was a paycheck at the end of the period. And it's really too bad for those kids because, the kids know, you don't realize, students know a whole lot about teachers that it's unbelievable. They know the the failings, they know the pluses, they know personalities that adults, their parents, and other adults couldn't realize how much students know about their teachers. And they have no bias in saying, I like that, or I don't like that, or you should get this one, and isn't she great, or whatever, or isn't he awful, and whatever, and what. They know where the teachers who have a heart, they know who they are.
You always strike me as a very no-nonsense teacher, and I'm curious if you have any techniques or strategies for how to sort of win the respect or to win over your class, especially at the beginning of the school year when you might get a new batch of kids. How do you set the tone and start to develop a relationship with them?
That's interesting that you should ask that question, because I didn't have discipline problems. The first week of school was always the hardest for me, because that's when you have to set the tone. And you're right, I had standards, and I didn't accept anything that was interrupting my classroom at all. But I would enter a classroom with a smile. And I would say, good morning, or hello, or, and I smile. I don't go in with a long face and a grump. and my classroom, my relationship with my students was reciprocal. I mean, when I taught to every single face in the classroom. And if I see that someone wasn't paying attention, I would stop. I've done this before, and I realized that the best way to discipline a student is to have the discipline come from his peers rather than from me. So that if a student wasn't looking at me and paying attention or looking out the window, I would stop and say, Jose, I'm up here, and what I'm saying is really important. I want you to get it. I know I'm not as pretty as your girlfriend, but, we'll have to do. And everybody would laugh. And they look at Jose, and Jose would be, So it came from the class. It didn't come from, I want to do it, right? And that's how it was.
That's such a great technique. I wouldn't even think of that, but that makes so much sense, right? It's a great way to win over the class and sort of turn the tables a little bit. How about on the first day of school? How would you come in and set the tone and try to engage and develop a connection right away? Would you ever have any repeat students from previous years that you could sort of...
Oh, yes. The nature of the classes that I taught in a speech department, I sometimes had students whom I had before because they're taking a different subject that I'm teaching, and so I would know them. And I had quite a number of repeat students in different areas. I might have had a student in dramatics who then would... come to my class because they found out I'm teaching public speaking the next term. And so they would register, or they'd know I'm teaching play production the next term, so they would join that. So whenever I would go into a class, I would look for someone that I knew. And my eyes would light up, and I'd say, "Oh, hi, John. How are you? How was your summer?" And so the class realized that somebody knew me. They did not always know me, the students, most of the students, but if someone knew me and then responded favorably to me, that also set the tone. And then if they ask that person, what's she like? Is she a good, easy marker? Is she, the questions that kids ask. And so they would get an idea of what I was like before they had too much to deal with me, because it was the first day. And so I counted on that. But I was not an easy marker, and they knew that. And they knew that I expected them to do their homework and that I checked. You know, some teachers don't check. They just say, you know, you read this or you do that, okay. But I always managed to spend a few minutes doing something in which I would check so that they knew that whatever I asked, I expected it to be done. And I carried forth from there. And my tone was usually light, deliberately. And if there was anything in the lesson that could bring forth some humor, I did. I made use of that. I recall I was teaching an English as a second language class, and we were working, and this is quite true for Hispanics. They have this kind of problem. We have the word sing, you know, I sing a song, S-I-N-G, and we have the word sin. I committed a sin, and that was a bad thing, sin. So the two words are on the board, sin, S-I-N, and sing, S-I-N-G. But some of the foreign students, the N-G, I'm using letters because it's hard to just say the sound. The sound is ing, you know, so I have to say N-G because doesn't come across too well.
Yep.
And they would interchange them. The N and the N. You see how hard it is? The NG and the N.
I do.
So I would say, okay, you know, and here they were saying sentence with I sing a song. I mean, whatever the sentence was. And I'd say, okay, let's stop. Open your dictionaries and look up S-I-N, because that's what you said, right? So they would open the dictionary, because that's a book they always had to have with them. They'd open the dictionary and they'd look at it, and then they'd say, oh, I didn't mean that, you know. So it was funny. Then they laughed, and we go back to the sentence they were saying with their pronunciation, and they would laugh because that was obviously not what they were saying. So whenever there was any kind of humor that would come up because of the nature of the work we were doing in class, I made a big deal of it. So that my class began to understand that I wasn't hard and fast and mean and whatever, but I went along with the flow, and it was interesting, and they responded very quickly. Yes. I recall one time the assistant principal had come into my room, had come to see me, and the door was locked. And the doors had half windows. And so he knocked on the door, and I went to open it to let him in. And so he came in, and he said to me very quietly, "You must never lock your door." I said, "Because if there's any problem, we need to make sure we can get into you." And I said to him, "I lock my door because the problems are outside." I said, "If there's any problem outside, my students would protect me." And I meant it. I know that they would come to my aid immediately. The problem was not inside, it was outside.
That's pretty amazing to have that relationship with your students. I appreciate what you say about trying to bring humor into the classroom and to lead into that as a way of making learning fun. I know that public speaking for a lot of people is, I think it's maybe one of the people's worst fears. A lot of people say their worst fear is public speaking. How do you tackle that? How do you make that fun? How would you help kids to get over that fear of public speaking? What was sort of your way of maybe showing them what their capabilities were and then allowing them to sort of realize it themselves?
Well, I would tell them that nobody is a born speaker. Everybody learns to speak well. And so, how do you do that? Well, that's what we're here to learn. We'll learn how to do that. I said there is one aspect of public speaking is to make sure that you keep your audience interested. And the second level, the second aspect, is to know what you're talking about. So that means you have to learn to get the information. And I always arranged one day in the school's term for a lesson in the library. And I had it all pre-planned, and I told the librarian what I expected the librarian to do. And it was what helped me, helped me when I was a student learning public speaking. This is how I had to get information also. And of course, the situation then was very different. We had no internet, we had no cell phones, we had no ways of getting information other than what was available. And what was available was the library. And what was in the library was the Reader's Guide to Literature, because that opened up the whole world to you. You take a subject, you go to the library, you go into the Reader's Guide, you look up the subject, and it opens up all of the areas in which that subject is available to you, and you have that information. So it was important that they knew how to get information on a subject that they chose. And as far as keeping your audience interested, well, you have to take the course. There were devices, I call them devices, in my lesson plan for the things you can do to incorporate into your content that would make people sit up and listen. And I could say to you, you want to learn how to do that, you'll have to take my course. But, to simply say them doesn't mean anything. But sometimes you need to make a statement that is debatable, that opens people's eyes and ears. Sometimes you need a quote from someone that you know is well known, an expert. Sometimes you need to open with a little funny story that happened to you that leads you right into what you want to say. Sometimes you need to use your voice and dramatic techniques to pull your audience to you as it goes into your content. I'm only giving you a little bit of a summary, but each of these requires delving into it and making it alive for the people you're speaking to. You asked about my connection to the students in my classes. Because I had some of these students in repeatedly, and especially with the ESL program, not as much in the speech arts. We have to divide that. The speech arts, dramatics, public speaking, play production, oral interpretation, discussion, debate, those are all in the speech arts. English as a second language is totally different, but it was offered in the speech department because it grew out of the foreign accent clinic. And it just fell into my lap because I had all that training at Cornell in speech correction. This was and in speech therapy at the hospital with correction. This was my baby, right? So it came into me very easily. So with the ESL classes, I had students who were there who had been in this country a very short time. Some had just come in and spoke no English. Some had learned English in their country and came in with a bare understanding of English. And some may have graduated elementary school and come into Jamaica High School with a greater knowledge of English, but still having a problem. So with students like this, you develop a very much closer relationship because you're dealing not just with a subject, but you're dealing with life and living in a country that was not your own. And as a result, I got to know these people and their problems sometimes, and you cannot imagine the problems that some of the students had in my ESL program. You cannot imagine how they arrived at this country. Did you want to hear any of the stories?
I'd love to.
I had a 17-year-old student from Afghanistan who was sent to this country by his father because at the age of 17, he would automatically have gone into the military. And that was dire for them. And the father apparently had money. And so he sent his son to this country. He gave him something like $30,000, equivalent to $30,000, which was in a belt around his body. He managed to go on horseback or camel to the nearest airport, nearest city, and flew. And every place he had to spend money. He had to spend money to the person who came with him to the airport. He had to spend money to get the necessary papers, etc. Everything that he did cost money, right? He immigrated to Germany and again paid whatever he had to pay, and then immigrated to England. Again, money spent. And by the time he came to the United States, I think he had something like $1,000 or $2,000 left.
Wow.
In this whole. Now, he's 17. He's 17. And he came into my class. And he stayed with me for a couple of years, from basic English to intermediate English to advanced English to transition. And during that time, he got a job. And he was working in McDonald's. Well, I'll tell you, he brought me all these discount coupons, which I used. My children loved it because we had half price on hamburgers and whatever else it was. But he gave me, which he just picked up at the store, the discount coupons were just distributed. But at any rate, in this process, 2 years later, a 15-year-old brother came. His brother came, and we went through the same process. And the first one graduated, but the second one was still in my class. And so I would ask him how his brother was doing. Oh, he's doing fine. By that time, this is 4 years later, he had already bought 2 franchises from McDonald's.
Wow.
2 franchises. So the desire to succeed is there, but the hardships, very, very hard. In order to arrive at what he did, he went through a very hard time.
And how did his speaking ability progress throughout the few years he had with you?
He got better all the time. He was fluent. He spoke with an accent, but he was fluent. His brother didn't have the wherewithal that his older brother had. The older brother was motivated, intelligent, and driving. He had a drive. The younger brother kind of, went along. I'm sure the older one had to take care of his younger one too.
I'm curious, did you ever have to give a sort of a speech to your public speaking class just to convince them that you were not only qualified, but going to be able to like make something of their speech abilities? How would you sort of show
now
the
you're
class?
switching.
Yeah,
Switching.
I'm backtracking to
Okay.
public speaking.
To public speaking. Okay. Kids don't like public speaking. I mean,
I think most adults don't like public speaking either.
no, it's not a favorite, I'll tell you. But when I started at Jamaica, the first year she was very kind. My chairperson. She gave me a dramatics class. I had never taught dramatics in my life before. And then the following semester, she gave me a public speaking class, which I had never taught because all my background was in speech therapy. And we had, for years, Jamaica High School had one public speaking class. And so anyhow, I taught it the second semester that I was there. And I taught it for many semesters afterwards. And when I left Jamaica High School, there were 3 public speaking classes offered. So the number of people asking for public speaking had increased.
Wow.
Dramatically. I mean, that's because each class we had a limit of 34. 34 students was maximum in our classes. That's a lot of kids. Anyhow, when I taught public speaking, and the kids would start coming in the first day, and they would say to me, I would say, "Good morning, Martin." And they say, "I don't know why I took this class. I don't know why I took this class. I really don't like public speaking." So that very first day, whenever I had to sign cards, the paperwork for your students in your class. So we got rid of that clerical work. And then I would tell them, "Do you want to hear this?"
Yeah,
Right?
I do.
I would ask them to take out a piece of paper and don't put your name on it. That made a big difference, when I don't have to admit to anything. And I said, "Just write down a topic that you would like to hear somebody talk about." And they did. And then I said, "Okay, fold them all up." And I would have a container and I'd collect them. And then I said, "Okay, here it is. I'm going to pick it out. I don't know. I'll take them out of this container. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to give you a very brief introduction as if I'm going to talk to you about this topic." And I did that. I would pick out a topic. I would give them an introduction, and then I would read, when it was done, I would read the topic. And I did it for three different ones. And the students would say, "How could you do that?" Because the topics came from somebody, from 3 students who wrote it in the classroom.
You would just give a little 3 to 5 minute speech on that topic?
3 or 5 minutes, 2 minutes.
Okay.
1.5 to 2 minutes. Short introduction, right? And they would say, "How could you do that?" I said, "Do you see what I just now did? That's what you are going to do at the end of the term. You're going to take something out of a hat, and you're going to give a minute or 2 introduction to the topic." Never. And that's how we began the class, because I said, what I did, you're going to do at the end of the term, because that's what you're learning in this class. Remember, nobody is born a speaker. You learn how to do it, and you are going to learn how to do that.
Wow, that must have really inspired them. That's great.
See, I'm excited. I'm excited just telling you this, because I loved what I was doing. And when I tell you, I wish I could do it again. I've gone to meetings of the FEF where they have a couple of students who are reading their own original poetry or whatever as a result of one of our funded projects.
Mm-hmm. And tell people what the FEF is.
The Falmouth Education Foundation. And we work with the teachers in the school system, K through 12, who want to try something new in in teaching in their classroom, some new idea, some project for which they don't have the money. And if they apply a grant, if we feel it's worthwhile, we grant them the money to try that project. Well, at any rate, at one time at the end of the semester when the project had ended, the students, this particular one was working on poetry, and the student got up and would say their poem, and I'd sit there and I'd say, why didn't the teacher come to me and ask me to come and help the students recite this poem? It's so good, but the delivery was not. And that's so typical. A student will just get up and read just words when, with a little coaching, it becomes a marvelous experience instead of just a recitation. And I get myself all excited over these things. I really still do. And how long have I been retired and still want to do this?
Well, I see the way that your eyes light up when you talk about teaching, and I can feel the passion that you have for it. And so I have to imagine that's probably a little frustrating for you when you see something that you know you could have fixed, you could have helped with, and but anywho, I think that's so beautiful that you still have that passion for it. And I'm actually reminded of another magnet on your refrigerator that I saw when I was writing down the exact wording for the first one that I brought up earlier in the episode. And the second one says, "It is hard to be a woman. And I'm actually going to read the rest off my phone because I don't want to butcher it.
Dear me, I thought that was so funny, but it's so true.
Right? You said, it reads, "It is hard to be a woman. You must think like a man, act like a lady, look like a young girl, and work like a horse."
Yes.
And I'm curious, tell me how that resonates with your experience, your professional experience.
You know, I loved what I was doing, and I worked hard. My school experience didn't end when I left the school. I would come home and I would also be planning lessons and thinking about things and new ways of doing something. That was one thing. But secondly, being in the school with the students was an exciting experience. You know, when the day was over, I was tired because I gave so much of myself, but I loved it because as not only was it good for my classrooms and for the kids and for their ambiance with me as a teacher, but it was good for me also because I felt I reached so many people, really. I was with them in that classroom experience. I just wasn't a teacher standing in front. We were all together and we were working together and that's why I did not have a discipline problem. There were some teachers in the school that the guidance people, well, I shouldn't say the guidance, but I forgot what they call them. They would have students sent by the same teacher every day. Some students always came down. And I think I taught there 26 years. I don't think I've ever sent more than 3 out of the classroom.
In 26 years?
In 26 years.
Wow.
And when they received one from me, they came running because I never do it. If she couldn't, if Borghese didn't send somebody, this is something I got attention immediately. But it just didn't happen because I felt that in my classroom we were all together. I was the teacher, but I was with them, and they were with me. I can't quite describe that. It doesn't sound like it's a normal thing to say, but, and I could never sit at a desk. I never sat at a desk. I always stood, and I didn't stand in one place. I would stand first on one place without even thinking. It was just, I saw these people here and I went over there, but I'm still talking to everybody. I was with them, not in front of them.
You guys were on the same team.
Yes.
That's nice. Well, I got to say, and I know I speak for probably a lot of your grandchildren and a lot of your children when I say I feel so lucky to have had you as my speech teacher as a young child, and then as my advisor and editor of my papers in grade school, and now as an adult to have you as an advisor for public speaking and speech giving. And my older brother Jesse just gave a speech to over 300 people, and I know that you were one of his close advisors on that speech, and I was so blown away by not only the content of his speech, but also the execution. And I know that you had a big part in that. And how nice does it feel to be able to still exercise those skills and still help people?
And how nice it feels that he was a success and that he reaped the benefit of all these people telling him what a great talk he gave. That because he's so happy, I'm happy.
That's great. It's so nice that you're still able to enjoy the things that you loved about teaching, even in your retirement.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Which is actually a good segue. How did you come to the decision to retire? What was that like?
Well, Tom was a college professor, and he always had a lot more time off than I did. In public school, we started the day after Labor Day, and it went through the 30th of June. That was the last day of school, was the 30th of June. He started, he had a break always for the month of January, and we started liking to travel. And he wanted to travel, and I couldn't do it. So our summers were we were so fortunate to come here to Woods Hole. He loved doing the work he did at the lab, and for him it was a vacation too. And although he was at the lab all the time, he too loved his work. But we did, Woods Hole, you have the beaches, you have all the summer activities, and with the family and children, with the science school and all of the other activities, it was a vacation. But I was planning to retire when I reached the age of 62. And they just couldn't wait. My children leave, and Tom leave. So I left a little earlier, which meant I couldn't even collect a pension, because you can only collect a pension when at 60, at 60 Social Security, and you get a minimum. But anyhow, I retired at 61, and that's when we did a lot of traveling. Every January, we took a cruise. And at the end of May, actually in the middle of May when college ended, that's when we came up to Woods Hole. They had to wait until June 30th before we could all go. And then my children went to college and they had the same situation. And then I retired. So it was a month and a half of staying in Woods Hole, much longer than I had ever stayed before. So that's how it happened that I retired when I did.
And when you did retire, were you excited to make that change? Were you nervous about stepping away from something that was such a huge part of your life and your energy? Did you miss it, or were you happy to retire? What was that transition like?
Well, I had friends. My department, we were a very close department, and we were all good friends with each other. Right? We traveled. Some of them during weekends, we would go away for the weekend to the Amish country, with 2 or 3 couples, also from my department, right? So we were very good friends. And I'll tell you what helped in that respect. The speech department, all of the people in the speech department always entertained at the school functions, especially at the end of year luncheon, which faculty, it was only for faculty, you know. It's the end of the year, faculty would come, but anytime there was a faculty celebration, it was always the speech department who did the entertaining. I told you, drama was, and the speech arts. And I was in that as well. I was up to my ears in that as well. So we were the speech department people were always well liked and known by everybody in the school. And if the speech department didn't do any performing, there was no event, nobody would come. They came for whatever we did. And whatever we did was original. And we worked hard. We took, we put our own words to well-known songs, and we went all the way. We flew with whatever idea we had. So I had a lot of friends in the speech department. And when I retired, I continued my friendships with some. And with some, we had what was called Regents Week, where the faculty is giving exams and students only come for exams. And so there's more flexibility in terms of the time that the teacher has in the school. When I retired, I could not step foot in the school. It was, when I left it, I closed the door, and that was the end of a part of my life. I never stepped foot in that school again.
Wow. And you loved it. And you loved it there.
I loved it. But it was a part of my life that closed. The door closed, and now I opened a new life. I mean, I did. I became very active in many organizations, volunteer-wise. And when I did meet my friends for lunch, I would meet them at the restaurant. I wouldn't go into this. I could not step into that school. I loved it, but it wasn't me anymore. I didn't belong there anymore. And I could not go in anymore.
Wow, that's really unique. I feel like you don't hear that a lot, but I'm glad that you were able to have that separation. And it sounds like it was really the best thing for you. As much as you loved your life in the school, it sounds like you really closed that chapter of your life and put your best foot forward.
But I still like doing the things that I did, you know? I still like doing those. So.
Well, it sounds like you've had, and I know that you've had, an incredibly fulfilling career. And, you know, for someone my age who's still really green and young in their career and figuring out what the next steps are, where do I want to go, what paths do I want to take, career can be a really scary thing for some people to think about. I'm curious. Please take. I can tell you I can tell you have something to say. So go right ahead.
Before we close the door on career, there are a couple of things that I can say along the way. When I was still doing the speech improvement in the elementary schools, I became active with the New York City Speech Association, which was an association of all speech teachers in all the schools at every level, from elementary, junior high, and high. And I became an officer. I was a secretary at one point, and then the following year or two, I became vice president. So I was very active in the New York City Speech Association. And we had a membership, don't forget, all speech teachers, whether you were a speech teacher in the high school, whether you were a speech improvement teacher, you belonged to the same organization. And we had over 1,000 members in this organization. And as secretary, it was my job to send out notifications of meetings to all of the people who belonged. And I wasn't married at the time, but I had my friends coming in, helping me with sealing all the envelopes and mailing 1,000 envelopes to all of the schools and all of the boroughs of New York City who were speech teachers. So that was a very enlightening experience for me. Also, there's a second thing I have to say, which colored my career all the way through. As I mentioned before, when I was at Cornell, my mentor was Professor C.K. Thomas. Well, in the New York City Board of Education, New York City, you didn't just need a license, you needed a license from the Board of Education of New York City to be able to teach in any of the schools. The president of the speech at the Board of Education was, may I mention names?
Sure.
Her name was Letitia Robichek, and she was known throughout the schools, throughout the city, all boroughs, in all of the schools where there was any speech work being done. And when I left the hospital, when I left working as a speech therapist, I still was communicating with my professor, C.K. Thomas, and I told him that I was considering trying to get into the Board of Ed, into New York City public school system. So he said to me, "Oh my," he said, and I had an interview with Letitia Robichek at that particular point, going into the system. And he said, "Oh my, she and I do not agree. She and I do not agree on quite a number of speech principles." I mean, I don't want to go into that because that takes a big, long story, and that's not necessary here. But he said to me, "When you have your interview, don't mention you know me." And so I went to this interview saying to myself, I hope she doesn't ask me. I hope she doesn't ask me, I hope it doesn't come up because what am I going to say, So anyhow, I have this interview with Letitia Robichek, and she talked about my background, and I went to NYU undergraduate. I went to Cornell. Oh, Cornell, I know several people. That's a very good school for speech and this and that. And I understand, so who was your mentor? C.K. Thomas. What could I say? I said, C.K. Thomas. "Oh, I know him very well. He's very respected," and whatever. Well, the interview went on. Okay, finished the interview. In the years following, Letitia Robichek never forgot me. And when I was still secretary of the New York City Speech Association, at one of our meetings, I was sitting on the dais because I had organized it, and Letitia Robichek was on the dais sitting next to me. And it was a time when, and I didn't know this, they were passing the what do you call passing the buck to the new people who were taking over,
Okay.
And I was going from secretary to vice president.
They were passing the baton.
Yes, and each person was asked to tell a little bit about your work to the person who was going to be secretary after you. So I didn't know that. And I had to get up and make the little speech about passing the secretarial work. And I said something to the effect that I don't remember what I said, but I said it's a very rewarding because you have contact with every speech person. I said not only is the work it's a good amount of work, but it's a very, very personal gratification to know. It's given me the opportunity to know all of you who are members, because I contact you all the time, right? And I was thinking of a word to say. I was giving something, and whatever it was I was saying. I said a couple of adjectives, And I was fishing for the adjective, and Letitia, right next to me, said it, and I said it right out, and continued. So she knew it wasn't planned because I was fishing for it, and it was fine. It was no blockage, no nothing. But she was right there, and she knew that everything I was doing was right off the cuff, right?
So she really had your back in that moment.
And she never forgot that I went to Cornell, because most of the people who were in speech in the city of New York, all boroughs, all came from city schools. I was out of a city school. I was whatever you call the 10. I can't think of.
You were outside of the area.
I was.
Well, where? Okay.
I was in one of the elite schools outside. I didn't come from the city school. So in years that passed, while I was still working at Jamaica High School, I decided I wanted to see if I could become a chairman. And so I took courses for chairmanship of a department. And then I took all the courses. I took with 3 or 4 other people that I knew. We were all a group of 4 that were doing studies together. And we were all set to take the exam. And I had to make a decision. Either I took the exam and passed it and got a chairmanship, or I got married. I could not do both. Tom was at Rutgers, and he had another year to go, which meant I'd be at Rutgers, right? I could still commute to Jamaica High School, but it was too difficult. And so I made the decision that I was not going to take the exam. So I saw Letitia Robichek, and I went to her and I said, because she knew that the exam was imminent, and I said, I'm not going to be able to take the exam, Dr. Robichek. I said, I'm getting married in June. Oh, well, I wish you luck, but right up to that point. In other words, and the 3 people with whom I had studied all passed, and they all got chairs somewhere or other.
Wow. It's funny how those, decisions like that really change the trajectory of your life.
Absolutely.
But yeah. Wow.
Yes.
Well, I want to bring it home.
Oh, before I go, do you know that your mother's aunt, Auntie, they called her Auntie. I want to say Auntie Mame, but it's not.
Lynn?
No, she passed away quite a while.
Madeline?
Yes, Auntie Madeline. Auntie Madeline, we were at a meeting. This is how many years ago? Mm-hmm. And we talked, Auntie Madeline and I were talking. She lived next door to Letitia Robichek. And she knew Letitia Robichek very well.
Wow. Small world.
I think that they may have talked because I had the connection with Robichek, right?
Wow.
Is that a small world?
Seriously.
Auntie Madeline knew, and we talked about Letitia Robichek.
Oh, that's so nice. I'm sure she was really happy to be able to keep a tab on you and see how your life was going. Well, I want to bring it home and talk about, what can be learned from looking at a career that was as fulfilling as yours. Like I said earlier, I can see your eyes light up, and I've known forever the passion that you have for what you do. And I'm curious if you have any words of wisdom for people who are much younger in their careers and, sort of figuring out what that might be, Is there anything that they should look for and pursue? Is there anything that they should avoid? If you were giving me advice, how would you tell someone my age to view and sort of navigate their career?
You have to like what you're doing. Sometimes you may be dazzled by money or prestige or another factor. But if you're going to be working at something that really doesn't please you inside, it's a drudge. And that's not saying that you don't look at the prestige and that you don't look at the money involved. Obviously, whatever you choose, it has to be able to support you in a comfortable life. So you do have to look at some of these other aspects. But in your core, you have to you have to love what you're doing. Because then, if you're not even working, you don't go to work then. When you love what you're doing, it's not work.
And then you forget to pick up your paycheck.
Oh, yes.
Wow. Well, I'm inspired just hearing that. And I feel like that's a great place for us to leave off here. Thank you again for having these conversations with me and being open to sharing them with the world. I think there's so much value, especially for younger folks in my generation who sort of, we were born into this online world, and so much of what we consume is online, and it's from other young people. And a lot of people my age don't have a grandparent that's still alive, or don't have a grandparent who's lives close enough to them that they can really have a close relationship, or maybe they don't have the mental sharpness that you have. And so I'm so grateful for you. I love you so much, and I'm so happy to be doing this and to be sharing it.
You're my love, Dante. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. We'll do it again soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.